Hey everyone, how are you doing? Over the month of August, I read 8.5 books. Now, if I was a booktuber with a high aesthetic, I would make this whole wrap-up video a parody of Fellini's film 8.5, but that would be a lot of work, and I'd rather just talk about the books, some of which I hugely enjoyed, some of which I really only appreciated once I got to the end of the book, some of which I really struggled through and had some issues with, and one which I didn't finish at all. So I'm gonna talk about the books, but first I need to express my huge appreciation and gratitude and how flattered I was and how wonderful it was to see a whole string of Booktube videos wishing me happy birthday, prompted by Shawn the Book Maniac, who made a whole book tag video centered around my birthday and questions related to me and things about my life and reading life, and it was so wonderful to see on my birthday morning. I just opened up Booktube and saw this whole group of videos. So that was so sweet and nice, particularly to see so many great recommendations of books and this real appreciation for my enthusiasm and excitement about books, which after all is what it's all about. And it was a huge boost to my confidence personally, as somebody who, I can struggle with self-confidence sometimes, even though, I appear really, I might appear confident and enthusiastic in my videos. I have those demons nipping at me sometimes saying oh, you're not good enough, you're just embarrassing yourself making these videos, and I know that's all in my head and I just need to get over it. And so it was a wonderful kind of validation that that people do appreciate at least my enthusiasm for books, because I know I'm not perfect, my opinions can be a bit off sometimes, and but that's okay, and it's just all about my enthusiasm and excitement for books and my interest in talking about them. So it was really wonderful seeing everybody's responses, and there were so many people responding, and so I'll put them links to their videos in the descriptions below. It's been wonderful seeing everyone's diverse answers. And if I missed out on your video, please let me know in the comments below. Post a link to it, because I would love to watch it and see your response to it. It was particularly funny seeing Oly Bliss's cheeky response to one of the question prompts, where he suggested a book that is about how to get to grips with different kinds of dying, because now apparently that I'm over 40, I need to start thinking about death more and preparing for how I want to die, because it's not too far off, I must be close to the grave. So that was so cheeky. I really adore him. It was really funny, but I'd like to think now that I'm over 40, I can remarket myself, now that I have a bit of white and gray in my beard, as just a daddy. I'm never gonna be a father, but I can be your daddy. So we'll see how that goes. But speaking of which, I'm not gonna talk much about what I did on my birthday or anything like that, but I was treated. My partner got me tickets to see a production of Eugene Ionesco's Exit the King at the National Theatre, which was so good, and which connects with my previous two videos I did talking about my bookshelf tour, talking about how Eugene Ionesco was one of my favorite authors when I was a teenager, and looking back at this list of my favorite books that I made when I was 20 years old, and listing his novel as one of my favorite books. And I felt a bit uncertain about how I feel about him now, because I hadn't really read him or seen much of his work performed in the past several years, so it's hard to get an idea if I think he is still good. But this play was so good. The staging of it was amazing. There was incredible actors of it, and I was in an incredible position. Part of the thing was that the stage would jut out into the audience, and I was sat right next to that part that jutted out into the audience, and so the actor's like robe would like brush over me as he turned around at some points. But I also found this play incredibly moving as a meditation on death, because Eugene Ionesco wrote it when he was very ill and he was starting to contemplate his mortality. And so as a contemplation of our mortality, it's a really effective drama of this fading monarch who has to get to grips with the fact that he's slowly dying and has to give up everything in his life. How in our consciousness, we are the primary actors in this play of our lives. And so it's that gradually letting go of that sense of ourselves as the protagonist in our own dramas. But also, because he's a monarch and a tyrannical monarch, it's about the shoring up of power. So there's a political message to the play as well that you can see played out in a lot of tyrannical leaders in the world, of shoring up power and having to, and the real violent fight to prevent yourself from releasing that power, and the negative effect that obviously has on everyone around him. So it was really powerful, good performance. I was so glad that and grateful that I was taken to see that play. So getting into the books that I actually read this month, I started the month with the Booktubeathon read-along and that I participated in, and so I already made a video about this and talking about my reactions to Cersei as I was reading it. I was so happy that I got to finally read this this wonderful reimagining of different Greek myths, and particularly, obviously, all focused around Cersei. And it's an incredibly enjoyable book, but also really poignant, as I talked about in the video. She's a really emotional writer, somebody who talks about romance so poignantly and feelings of exclusion so poignantly. But also there's an incredibly serious side to this, and talking about the role of women in society and reactions to women. And there was a section which particularly moved me, which I haven't really heard talked about much in reactions to this book, where there's a part where Cersei is raped, and her emotional reactions to men after that was really poignantly described. She talks about how there's, when she takes different sailors who come to her island, to her bed, and she states how, "I might take him to my bed. It was not desire, not even its barest scrapings. It was a sort of rage, a knife I used upon myself. I did it to prove my skin was still my own. And did I like the answer I found?" And that is such a powerful description of the pathos of someone who has experienced such trauma, and how that it becomes this like weapon that somebody uses against themselves in their further relationships with other people. I found that so powerfully moving, and yeah, and there's so many snippets like that throughout the book, where she gives such profound insights into the human condition. So I wanted to mention that, and also this other book of short stories which I started reading during the marathon, called How to Love a Jamaican, short stories by Alexia Arthurs. This is her debut book, and I was slightly unsure about some of these stories at first, but by the end of the collection, it all sort of came together for me, both because it's a portrait of different Jamaicans who emigrate to America and live there, or who were living in America and go back to Jamaica, or it's about the children of Jamaican immigrants, first generation Americans who are struggling with this sense of split identity between their Jamaican selves and their American selves. And I could relate to this so much on a personal level as somebody who is American, who has lived half his life in the UK now. You know, I obviously it's not the same for me as somebody who appears completely white that came from a white culture and is living in a predominantly white culture. But I could relate to it in a split sense of national identity, of finding it difficult sometimes to relate to British people. And for the first several years of living in the UK, like I did really struggle with this sense of my American self living in the UK and integrating into the culture. Like, you know, you would think that there's some superficial differences and it wouldn't matter all that much. And I've talked to other people who have moved to the UK who feel the same way, that there are subtle cultural differences which can like creep up on you and make you feel alienated in different ways. And so I remember one point in particular, after several years living here, I started longing for just having a dialogue with other Americans. And I was in this tea shop by myself and I was reading, and this really bright-eyed American came in, and she was so enthusiastic talking about visiting the UK, and she went and sat by herself with a cup of tea. And so I went over and introduced myself and said, hey, I'm American too, and we got to have this conversation. And I just wanted to have a dialogue with another American. And so it's like interesting how, yeah, you can have these feelings of alienation over the time and want to connect with people like yourself while living in this other culture. And it's portrayed in these stories in really interesting and varied ways how people experience these feelings, really with a wide range of characters, from an old man who has an illegitimate child that he wants to have a connection with while still having his primary marriage and family life, and another woman who's moved to America and has tried having relationships with different Americans and is finally sort of settling having a relationship with another Jamaican man who has moved there, who obviously isn't quite the right man for her, but feels like she should be with him because he's also Jamaican, so they have this shared heritage and sense of culture. And also a story about a woman who is obviously a thinly veiled portrait of Rihanna, of this Jamaican woman who came to America and become this major pop star, and this sense of duality that she still feels, where Jamaican is still her home, and where when she's in Jamaica, she's still just sort of this hometown girl, but in America, she's obviously this mega celebrity, and the subtle conflicts that makes for her psychology. So there is that, and there is also the novel Ponti, which I started during the readathon, and which I wanted to read particularly because there was a Lush book club focused on this book, where Sharlene Teo was interviewed by my friend Anna James, and it was a really lovely interview, lovely occasion. Like the Lush book club is an amazing thing. Like tickets were free to go to it, and then you were given a copy of the book and also some Lush products, all for free, which is amazing. Like I guess it's just sort of a publicity thing for them, that they just want to raise awareness of the shop, and also are obviously enthusiastic fans of books. And so it was really interesting, good conversation about this novel, and which again was a book that I had some reservations with at first, because it has 3 different strands of narrative, and the primary narrative all around the central character, I was really attached to her voice and just wanted to stay with her narrative. But by the end of the book, it did all come together and was really poignant in how it showed the difficulty between the different relationships of the characters. There's a mother-daughter relationship and the relationship between 2 friends who were kind of awkward teens that bonded together. And it shows it over 3 different periods of time, a really interesting way of looking at the ruptures in these different relationships. And I particularly found the relationship between the mother and daughter to be so poignant at the end, where the daughter was looking, who wanted to praise the mother and get her approval, but the mother wasn't really capable of having that sort of relationship with her daughter, was really moving, like drove me to tears. And yeah, I thought this was a beautiful novel, and I think it's just been released in America, so yeah, great book. I read Patrick Gale's new novel, Take Nothing With You, which is really poignant, a different kind of coming-of-age story where the novel starts at the later on in a man's life where he's experiencing massive changes because he's been diagnosed with cancer, and so he's undergoing chemo treatment. And he's looking back at his early life and development and his growing love of the cello, playing the cello and becoming a musician, and how that path to becoming a musician was stuttered by his development of his sexuality and coming to terms with being a gay man. And it was done in a really creative, different kind of way that I haven't read before. And I particularly enjoyed how he showed his navigating through different kinds of sexual experiences as a teenager and navigating that difficult terrain of how boys, particularly in gay relationships early on, have different expectations, and there's a different power dynamic going on. So that was a really interesting portrayal. And it was also wonderful, I got to go to the launch party of this book, which was held on a beautiful roof terrace overlooking the Thames. And so it was good to see Patrick, who I've known for many years. And it was interesting. It's a shame really that he hasn't really ever broken out in America, or his books haven't been published much in America, because he's sort of pigeonholed as a British writer and that he wouldn't translate to international audiences. But I think Americans would really like his work. So I hope his books are published in America, because he's really like quite a good selling, his books have been bestsellers here in the UK, and I think they could be in America as well. And he's a really great writer. And so yeah, that was really good to go to that event. And it was fun. At the party, the writer Neil Mukherjee was there, so I got to chat with him for a while. And they had these glass containers of rhubarb custard sweets there, and Neil and I stole a jar of them. I wasn't sure if we were allowed to take them or if people were supposed to eat them there, but we thought they were really cute, so we wanted to take some for ourselves. So that was fun. And I also read Tim Winton's new novel, The Shepherd's Hut, this month. And he's a writer who was described by one journalist as this writer of macho romanticism, because he's especially good at capturing these very tough, like stereotypically macho men, and the emotional sides of their lives, which we don't often see because there's this sort of hard, gruff exterior, which I think is particularly symptomatic of Australian culture, and particularly rural Australian culture, where there's this much more prevalence of a kind of macho type culture, and men feel like they need to hold themselves to this standard of being very macho. But he shows that there's a real emotional, obviously there's a real emotional side to their lives and these feelings which they aren't able to express. And I know some people find that a bit hard to take, or find it a bit cliched, of these men who are really hard and tough on the outside and really aggressive and combative, but on the inside they have a heart of gold. And it is sort of that, but I think he portrays it in a bit more complex way. Like, you can really see how his main character in this novel he's not perfect. He has some really dodgy attitudes, but he has this real feeling side, and the way he shows how he's been maligned in society and really outcast, and he doesn't have the support network that he needs. He had an incredibly abusive father, and really there should be systems in place in society, if it's a positive and progressive society, to assist him in getting out of that situation and helping him and his mother, who was also abused. But he wasn't, and so he's sort of isolated and alone. And the novel begins in a very dramatic way, where he has to go out on his own, and he is literally like out in the wilderness trying to survive by himself. And he portrays that strife in a real physical, visceral way, which is so powerful and poignant, and how he strikes up this connection with another very isolated man who's been isolated for very different reasons, and about their connection, very tentative connection between them. And I thought it was a powerful, really beautiful novel, so I hugely enjoyed this book. And then I read a couple novels that have been longlisted for the Booker Prize, and these are going to be so interesting to talk about in relation to each other and about the whole meaning of the prize, because one, Washington Black, I found incredibly readable and hugely enjoyable, but also really powerful in what it was saying. And then Milkman, which started out with a bang, really great, and I was into right away, but then become much more laborious and difficult to read, and which I really appreciated overall, but I found the structure of the narrative to just be, it was a bit of a slog, honestly, like, and I found I struggled going back to it, in that it was one of those books that I just like, okay, I should go back to reading this and be duty bound and go back to reading it, but it's something I had to push myself to do, where with Washington Black I was so excited to go back to it every time and find out what was happening in the story. So in Washington Black, it depicts a boy who grows up as a slave on a plantation in Barbados, but he has a very creative scientific mind and a great talent for art and drawing, and how this would normally be totally passed over, and he would just live a slave for his entire life, were it not for his companionship with the brother of the plantation owner, who is a sort of amateur scientist, and who comes to appreciate the talents of this boy. And so they strike up a companionship and a collaboration in scientific experiments, and it leads them off in many different adventures all over the world. And I found it really interesting listening to Britta's review of this book, because she sort of found it a bit light as like an adventure story, and it is a story that uses kind of tropes of adventure stories where it makes it really compulsive reading. But I think there are much deeper, stronger themes to it, which you can read into it, and which are really poignant, thinking about people in the history of the world who, just because of the circumstances which they were born into, they weren't able to utilize their talents and their potential in the way that they could if they had been born in a society that gave them more opportunities. And you think about how there have been so many people throughout history who have been born into these circumstances, and how incredibly sad that is. And so she portrays that in a really powerful way. And one scene in particular that I especially appreciated, and which I think just must be one of my particular things that I love in novels, when I love it in a novel when characters go underwater, when there's underwater scenes with characters, and there's a part where he goes on this sort of amateur scuba diving thing underwater and discovers there a whole world which is kind of liberating, because it's totally different from the worlds that he normally inhabits. And so obviously it's an alien world that he can't be a part of, but it's just this glimpse of an entirely different place where he's liberated from all the weight of expectation and the stereotypes that are placed upon him because of his skin color, because of his circumstances. And I just find that so beautiful. It was also done in Jennifer Egan's novel, Manhattan Beach, and I really related to that section as well. But yeah, it's so beautifully portrayed in this novel. So the writing is really beautiful, but also the way she structures this story to tell a really poignant story, which also I think could be interpreted as a really political story because of his namesake of George Washington Black, and so he's actually named after the original plantation owner, but obviously everybody he meets connects him with the first American president. So you can relate this in a political way to recent times of that America recently had a black president and now has a very different kind of president. And so it's thinking about how important looks are when looking at our leaders and how important it is to look behind the superficial aspects of people to the strength of their intelligence and creativity and ability to have empathy. So I think you could interpret it as a much more political book, but obviously as a historical novel and read, it's a wonderful, enjoyable book. I mean, there's really serious themes to it, but it's really enjoyable to read. So I think it's interesting thinking about the Man Booker Prize in terms of readability, which is an issue which has come up before, of readability in books, and we talk about this a lot in book prizes. And so I think with Milkman, you can say it's a book whose readability isn't as evident, but does have some really powerful things to say, and which I did really appreciate. And some passages of this book are so beautiful and powerful, they just struck me, but other passages are difficult and weighty. So it takes place in Northern Ireland and is about a young woman who's 18 and who just wants to remove herself from these circumstances. It's the time during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and she wants to remove herself from these really divided political circumstances where everyone is forced to take sides. And she removes herself in this really touching way where she just walks around the city of this, it's not named, but it's probably the city of Belfast, and she's reading all the time, and she's reading while she's walking these 19th century novels that she wants to escape into and escape into another time, but she can't escape her environment and her circumstances. People see her and there's lots of judgments placed upon her because she just walks around reading. But particularly because at the start of the book, this man, this very shady man who has the nickname Milkman, he's not an actual milkman, he's more a gangster type, who just sidles up to her one day and starts talking to her. And just because he's talking to her and people see him talking to her, they start to make assumptions about their relationship and about her political beliefs, and it lands her in hot water, and she's suddenly involved in all this political strife and these politics that she doesn't want to be involved in, but she's forced to be involved in. And there's a real indignation there that, you know, she just wants to live her life, and but she's forced to be involved in these things just because of this association. And it's very much a gender thing because particularly as a woman, people make assumptions about her because of this. Obviously, in a stereotypical way, the onus isn't placed upon the man that talks to her without her permission, but on her, and start making assumptions about her as a woman, that they, assuming that they must have some sort of sexual relationship, and that she's become a lackey for this, a part of the political movement that's going on, and political resistance that's going on. So yeah, they're really powerful themes, but the narrative of it is quite laborious in how it's executed, in that it shows in a really detailed way the process of her thoughts and her really examining the situation in Northern Ireland and how people aren't given a choice to be independent or free from this politically contentious situation. And she details that in such a way that it does make it quite difficult to read. And so it's challenging to talk about this book because, yeah, it's like, I mean, you can make comparisons to James Joyce's Ulysses, which is, you know, people hold up a lot of the time as one of the greatest novels ever written, but you think about the readability factor of Ulysses, like it's not a book that people will just sit down with and think about as like a comfort read. Or maybe some people do, because, you know, I think about the novel The Waves by Virginia Woolf, which is one of my favorite books and which I do go back to continuously as a novel to find that I find so many different things in and which I find so much inspiration from, but isn't a novel which upon first reading it, it's a challenging novel. And so so I know a lot of people don't relate to it in that way, but I do. And so, you know, I think some people do feel this way about Milkman, but I think for the majority of people, would find it a difficult read. So that's just as a way of saying that, like, a reason why I like book prizes, and that I'm glad that the Booker Prize has raised these issues with these two novels in particular, of thinking about readability and what we want from novels and what we expect from novels and what we're going to hold up as the greatest literature that's being produced today, because you could take a lot of different perspectives on it. So I think that's all really interesting. And also I have to make an admission because at the end of the month there was also the Women in Translation Readathon, which I was so excited about, and I made a TBR pile of it and I was really enthusiastic about it, but I completely majorly failed at, because in the last week of August it just happened that I was so busy with work and I was really stressed, and it was yeah, a really busy week, and I just didn't get to read as much as I wanted to. And so that was such a shame, because I was so excited to join in with Matthew and Kendra's and Jennifer's readathon week, but I just couldn't do it. But luckily I'd read, before the week actually started, I'd read a book of a woman in translation, People in the Room by Nora Lane. And I found this book so interesting. Again, it's on a readability factor. It's a sort of challenging book. It's quite short, but it's quite experimental in its style and doesn't have a traditional plot or story, in that it's mainly just about a woman, again, it's an 18-year-old woman who is on the cusp of adulthood and is thinking about her life, and where having to leave off a certain sense of imagination and playfulness from her youth and going forward into adult life. And the entire book is about her sitting in a window observing these other three women in a window across the way, these neighbors, and looking at these three women and placing upon them all these ideas about who these women might be. Are they involved in something sort of sinister, in like a murder plot, or are they like these spinsters who have just decided to live this self-enclosed life, or do they have different struggles or conflicts between them? And she's just placing all of these thoughts and feelings upon them. And she has some tentative engagement with the women, but she doesn't actually want to really know who they are. She wants to avoid actually finding out who they are, because she just enjoys placing upon them all of her thoughts and feelings and imaginative scenarios that she makes for them. And so there's a question throughout the whole novel about, are these women actually real? They might just be mannequins placed in a window, or they might be actually women who are living across the way, or they might just be figments of her imagination, these women that she's coming up with in her mind as characters in these stories that she's creating. So there's this interesting tension throughout the book. But also, it says this in the introduction, but I read the introduction afterward because I didn't want to have any spoilers or have any ideas about how I would interpret the story placed upon me before I actually read the book. But I got this sense throughout reading the book that I was sort of reminded of that famous portrait of the Brontes by their brother Branwell, of the three girls sitting there together, and they have these sort of blank expressions on their faces, which you could sort of read anything into. And for some reason, while reading the novel, I started thinking about that portrait. And then when I read the introduction, I learned that Nora Lane was actually inspired by that portrait of the Brontes. And so it's kind of incredible that she doesn't actually reference that portrait in the novel, but I did get this sense, and I guess because it's one of those iconic images of three women, and that I obviously know because I read a lot of books. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting. That just came up in my mind while reading the novel, and which is a really interesting portrait to look at, and you can read so much into that portrait. So yeah, I really enjoyed and appreciated this novel, which was written many years ago, but was only just recently translated into English for the first time. So yeah, there was that. And then the other book of A Woman in Translation that I started to read at the very beginning of the readathon was Marguerite Yourcenar. I have such trouble saying her surname. Yourcenar, of Memoirs of Hadrian, which is her novel about the Emperor Hadrian during Roman times. He apparently wrote a memoir of his life, but that memoir has been lost, and so she's imaginatively recreated this memoir. And I started reading this at the beginning of the week. I got up very early in the morning, and it was wonderful when I got up early in the morning. Recently, sometimes I found if I get up around 6 a.m. or 7 a.m., I find a fox wandering around in my back garden. And so when I'm reading in my living room, I like to think of him as sort of like a companion to my reading time, even though I know he's just scavenging for food before he goes to sleep. But yeah, I liked that. It was nice. I had an encounter with him early in the morning and got to take a picture of the book of him in this book as I started reading it. But anyway, this book starts off so strongly and really poignantly describes the human condition in different ways, and that sounds pretentious, but the writing is really so incredibly powerful, much more so than I think like any other book that I've read recently. Just these breathtaking passages of the meaning of life and just existing as a person, and in this real general way that anyone could relate to, even though she's writing in the guise of this emperor from Roman times. And but then the novel goes into his actual experiences, recollecting his early life growing up during Roman times and then becoming an emperor, and the political negotiations that have to take place for him to get in that position. And I was sort of put off from the book, which is so strange because of such a powerful opening, and then going into this real detailed amount of time. And I'm sure it's maybe just the circumstances I was reading in, because like I said, I was so busy last week and my head was elsewhere, that I couldn't get into that story, because there's a lot of specific references to different political figures during the time and different wars, and I just don't know enough about Roman times to really appreciate that. Like I just felt a bit alienated and confused about what was actually happening. So I think I need to go back to this when I have proper time and can have the patience to take in that story and try to figure it out, because yeah, at the moment I was just a bit alienated from it and couldn't get into it. So I think it raises other interesting questions about what we want from historical novels. And I was talking about this with Britta in regards to Washington Black, about what we want from historical novels, which I think a really interesting question. Like, do we want a proper representation of how someone in those times would have actually perceived and lived in that experience, which feels like it would be true to the experiences of the time. But do we really want that from our historical novels? Because, you know, we, particularly from a historical novelist writing in our present time, like, you know, you can never truly capture that experience from the past and know what the mindset of somebody would be in that past time. But then, you know, you obviously want to try to be true to that time and issues that people would have been grappling with during that time, and you want to be as faithful to that as possible. But also, I think you need to imbue it with a modern aesthetic and a modern sensibility to show how this historical time and history and the past influences the present and where we are today. And so it's striking up that balance of what we want. And I feel like even though she is probably really true to what Hadrian's experiences were and point of view was during that time, you can't really it's difficult to relate to as a person in modern times, because he's just talking about it almost conversationally in a way that is alienating for a modern reader who isn't up on Roman history. So yeah, I think that's all really interesting to think about, and it's a novel I do want to go back to because like I said, the writing in it is so powerful, and I'll probably read and reread the early passages of this book because they are so incredible in their insights. But yeah, the rest of the book I'm gonna have to take time and patience with. So that is all my reading of for August. I'm sorry this has gone on for a while, but there's a lot to talk about and a lot of interesting things to talk about. But let me know if you've read any of these books, if you have any thoughts on the issues I've talked about in relation to book prizes and readability of books and what we expect from books. But also let me know what you've been reading, if you've read any particularly exciting things this month and your thoughts about them, if you're reading the Booker Prize list, or if you've participated in the readathons, either the Booktubeathon or the Women in Translation readathon. I hope you had more success with it than I did. I feel really bad that I just failed in it, but you know, life things come up and you can't help when your reading gets interrupted because you get busy in your life, and that's just the way things go. So hope you're doing well. Thank you for watching, and happy reading, everyone.